He was 42, a former Navy SEAL, and had just been thrown out with nowhere left to go. No family waiting for him, no savings left, just an old military duffel bag, a fading camouflage jacket, and an aging German shepherd named Shadow who still refused to leave his side. With the last money he had, Michael Reed bought a forgotten fire station in a tiny Montana town most people had never heard of. The roof leaked when it rained. The upstairs windows were shattered. Half the town believed the old building should have been torn down years ago, but what nobody in Red Oak knew was that beneath that abandoned fire station, hidden behind a sealed wall untouched since the Cold War, was a secret connected to Michael's late father, and a discovery that would change not only his life, but the entire town forever. Before we continue, if stories about faith, loyal dogs, and second chances still mean something to you, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The late summer air in Asheville carried the smell of warm pine, distant rain on the mountains, and old asphalt baking beneath a pale golden sun. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood quietly beyond the city, like ancient guardians watching lives rise and fall beneath them. Michael Reed had once believed mountains made a man feel small. Now, at 42 years old, he thought they simply reminded a man how much could disappear without the world noticing. He stood outside the narrow brick apartment building on Bartlett Street with one duffel bag at his feet and a German shepherd sitting beside him in silence, both of them staring at a locked door that no longer belonged to them. Michael was the kind of man people noticed even when he wished they wouldn't. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with the heavy posture of someone who had spent most of his life carrying equipment, responsibility, or ghosts. His dark brown hair was clipped short in an old military buzz cut now threaded with strands of gray above the ears. A rough layer of stubble covered his square jaw, and faint scars traced pale lines across his sun-weathered hands. His blue-gray eyes had the distant watchfulness common in men who had spent too many years expecting danger around corners. Years in the Navy SEALs had hardened his body, but losing almost everything after leaving the service had hardened something deeper. He wore a faded Navy SEAL digital camouflage uniform jacket without combat gear, old tan tactical boots, and dark cargo pants worn thin at the knees. The uniform no longer belonged to the military officially, but Michael still wore it on hard days because it reminded him there had once been a version of himself who understood his purpose. Beside him sat Shadow, an 11-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur and a muzzle gone silver with age. One of Shadow's back legs stiffened slightly whenever he stood too quickly, a lingering injury from an operation overseas years ago. His amber eyes remained sharp and intelligent, always moving between Michael and the world around them, as if constantly checking whether his human was still safe. A faded red bandana hung loosely around the dog's neck beneath an old leather collar scratched with years of use. Shadow had served beside Michael longer than most people had stayed in his life. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded eviction notice again, even though he had already read it 4 times. Final notice, 3 months overdue. Property locked. Simple words, cold words, words that didn't care how a man got there. The apartment manager, Denise Holloway, stood behind the office window pretending not to look at him. Denise was a heavy-set woman in her late 50s with dyed auburn hair and sharp eyebrows permanently arched like she expected disappointment from everybody. She wasn't cruel by nature. Life had simply worn her patience down into something practical. Years earlier, Michael remembered her bringing Christmas cookies to tenants, but rising prices, unpaid rent, and endless complaints had slowly carved warmth out of her voice. When Michael had begged for another week 2 nights ago, Denise had sighed without meeting his eyes. "Mike, I already gave you 3 extensions. I can't keep doing this." He hadn't argued after that. Pride exhausted itself eventually. Shadow slowly stood and limped toward the apartment door, sniffing beneath it before sitting again. The dog waited there for almost a minute like he expected Michael to unlock it and say everything had been a misunderstanding. Watching him hurt more than the eviction itself. "I know, buddy," Michael muttered quietly. "I thought we had more time, too." The truth was the collapse had started long before today. It started 2 years earlier when Michael trusted an old teammate named Eric Dalton. Eric had been charismatic, sharp-jawed, smooth-talking, the kind of former soldier who could convince exhausted veterans that one lucky investment would finally give them peace. Michael had poured nearly all his retirement savings into Eric's construction startup. 6 months later, the company collapsed under debt, lawsuits, and unpaid taxes. Eric disappeared to Arizona before the investigations even finished. Michael never saw him again. After that came the night security job downtown, 12-hour shifts outside office buildings while Asheville slept. The pay barely covered rent, but it kept him and Shadow afloat until Shadow's leg worsened during winter. Vet visits became medications, medications became surgeries. Michael chose the dog every time. Missing work to care for Shadow cost him the job soon after. People always said veterans were heroes until the rent was due. Michael adjusted the old duffel bag over his shoulder. Everything he owned fit inside it now. 2 uniforms, 3 shirts, military records, dog medicine, and an old photograph folded inside a Bible he hadn't opened in years. Across the street, traffic rolled by without slowing. Tourists laughed outside coffee shops. College students crossed intersections carrying backpacks and iced drinks. Nobody noticed the former Navy SEAL and aging dog becoming homeless in broad daylight. Shadow suddenly nudged Michael's hand with his nose. "You hungry?" Michael asked. The dog tilted his head slightly. Michael checked his wallet. $58. That was everything left after paying Shadow's latest prescription. He walked to a nearby gas station and bought 1 ham sandwich and a bottle of water. Outside, he sat on the curb beneath the fading sunlight and split the sandwich in half. Shadow took his piece gently, but didn't eat immediately. Instead, the old dog pushed half of it back onto Michael's knee. Michael stared at him for several silent seconds before laughing softly through tired eyes. "Yeah," he whispered, voice rough. "Guess we're both stubborn." For the first time that day, the crushing pressure inside his chest loosened slightly. Not because things were better. They weren't. He had nowhere to sleep, almost no money, and winter would arrive in a few months. But Shadow was still there beside him, breathing steadily in the warm Carolina evening, like loyalty itself had taken physical form. Then Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. But something made him answer. "Michael Reed," an older male voice asked. "I think I found something that belonged to your father, and you're going to want to hear this." The Asheville bus station smelled like burnt coffee, wet pavement, and old air conditioning that never quite worked properly. Outside, the morning sunlight stretched across the sidewalks in pale gold bands, while the Blue Ridge Mountains stood hazy in the distance beneath a cloudless Carolina sky. Michael Reed sat near the far wall beneath a flickering departure board with Shadow lying beside his boots. The old German shepherd resting his head across Michael's foot as though afraid the man might disappear if he moved too far away. Around them, people carried backpacks, suitcases, paper cups, and ordinary destinations. Michael carried a duffel bag, and the uncomfortable feeling that his entire life had narrowed down to whatever happened next. The mysterious phone call from the night before had lasted less than 3 minutes. The older man on the line never introduced himself properly. He only claimed he had once known Michael's father and mentioned an abandoned fire station in Montana connected to unfinished business. Before Michael could ask more questions, the caller simply said, "Look up Red Oak Station 7, and hung up. At first, Michael thought it was some kind of scam. Veterans got targeted all the time. But sleep had been impossible after that call. Curiosity had crawled into his mind and refused to leave. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, sitting on a bus station bench while Shadow slept beside him, Michael searched government surplus listings on his phone. That was when he found it. Red Oak Fire Station Number 7, Red Oak, Montana. Population 463. Status: condemned municipal property. Minimum tax bid, $10. The listing included 3 photographs. A 2-story red brick fire station with faded white numbers above an old garage door. Broken upstairs windows, rust crawling along the metal tracks, tall oak trees surrounding the building like silent guards. For reasons Michael couldn't explain, the place felt familiar. Not logically familiar, emotionally familiar, like seeing a face in a crowd that reminded you of someone long dead. He stared at the photographs for nearly 20 minutes, while Shadow watched him quietly. "You think I've officially lost my mind?" Michael asked. Shadow thumped his tail once against the tile floor. Michael laughed softly under his breath. "Yeah, probably." The woman working the ticket counter that morning was named Carla Bennett, a thin woman in her early 30s with dark braided hair, tucked beneath a Navy station cap. Her tired eyes suggested someone raising children while working double shifts. A silver wedding ring rested on her finger beside chipped blue nail polish. Unlike most station employees, Carla spoke gently instead of mechanically. "You traveling alone?" she asked while typing into the computer. Michael glanced down at Shadow. "Not exactly." Carla leaned slightly over the counter to look at the dog. "He's beautiful." "Old," Michael corrected quietly, but still stubborn enough to argue with God. That made her smile. "Where you headed?" "Montana." She raised her eyebrows. "That's a long ride." Michael nodded. "Yeah, I think that's the point." After buying the ticket, he checked his wallet again. $26 left. That was all. $26 between him and complete failure. Enough for a little food, dog medicine for maybe another week, and not much else. Still, something inside him felt strangely calmer after the purchase. Fear became easier to carry once a direction existed. The bus pulled out just after sunrise. Asheville slowly disappeared behind them as highways curved through forests and mountain ridges glowing green beneath bright summer light. Shadow settled beside Michael's boots, occasionally lifting his silver muzzle whenever the bus stopped. Children smiled at him when passing down the aisle. An older veteran wearing a Vietnam cap nodded respectfully toward Michael's camouflage jacket, but didn't speak. Soldiers recognized certain silences in each other. By afternoon, the mountains opened wider around them. Sunlight spilled across valleys filled with pine trees and rivers reflecting pale blue skies. Michael leaned his forehead against the window and watched America pass by 1 mile at a time. Small gas stations, farmhouses, rusted tractors, churches with peeling white paint, places forgotten by most of the country. He realized those were the places he trusted most now. During a stop in Tennessee, Michael bought a cheap sandwich from a vending machine and filled Shadow's water bowl outside beside the buses. The old dog limped slightly more than usual that day. Michael noticed it immediately. He always noticed. "You holding up okay?" he asked quietly. Shadow pressed his head gently against Michael's chest for a moment before sitting beside him beneath the warm afternoon sun. The truth Michael never admitted aloud was simple. Losing Shadow terrified him more than homelessness did. The dog had been there through Afghanistan, panic attacks, sleepless nights, divorce papers, and every terrible silence afterward. Shadow had watched Michael become someone harder and lonelier after the military, yet stayed anyway. People left. Shadow never had. Night settled over the highway somewhere past Nebraska. Most passengers slept with their heads against windows while dim blue lights glowed overhead. Outside, endless fields rolled beneath moonlight like dark oceans. Michael sat awake staring ahead while Shadow breathed steadily beside him. His stomach growled painfully. He reached into his bag and pulled out the last packaged honey bun he had bought at the station. He broke it carefully in half and handed one piece to Shadow. The old German shepherd sniffed it, ate only half, then nudged the remaining piece back into Michael's hand with his cold nose. Michael stared at the dog for several seconds before swallowing hard. Something inside his chest twisted unexpectedly. Not sadness, exactly. Something deeper. The unbearable weight of being loved without conditions. "You're a terrible survival partner," Michael whispered hoarsely. Shadow rested his head across Michael's knee. Outside the window, distant lightning flickered silently across the plains far beyond the highway. Then Michael noticed something strange. Tucked inside the folded property listing on his lap was a handwritten note he had never seen before. The paper looked old, yellowed at the edges. Only one sentence had been written across it in faded blue ink. "If you're reading this, your father was here before you." Michael froze, because the handwriting looked exactly like his father's. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Red Oak, bright and impossibly blue, with sunlight pouring across the quiet town like warm honey over old wood. Pine trees swayed gently beyond the railroad tracks while dry autumn wind carried the scent of dust, cedar, and distant chimney smoke through the streets. Michael Reed stepped off the final bus just after noon with Shadow limping closely beside him, both of them stiff from nearly 2 days of travel. The station wasn't really a station at all, just a gravel pull-off beside an old gas station with faded Coca-Cola signs hanging crookedly beneath the awning. The town itself looked frozen somewhere between survival and abandonment. Red Oak had one grocery store, one church with a white steeple, a feed supply shop, and a diner called Marlene's Kitchen where a rusted bell above the door jingled every time someone entered. Pickup trucks lined the streets. Most buildings were older than Michael. Some looked older than the railroad itself. People noticed him immediately, not because of the uniform jacket, not even because of Shadow. Small towns noticed strangers because strangers interrupted routines. Men sitting outside the diner paused conversations when Michael passed. A teenage cashier inside the gas station watched him carefully while pretending to organize candy shelves. An elderly woman watering flowers near the church stopped long enough to follow him with cautious eyes. Michael understood the feeling. He had once approached unknown villages overseas with the exact same instinct. Observe first, trust later. Still, being looked at like a problem before speaking a single word exhausted him more than the journey had. Shadow walked slightly ahead now, ears alert, scanning the streets with calm discipline. Age had slowed his body, but not his instincts. The old German shepherd still carried himself like a working dog. Children peeking from inside parked trucks smiled when they saw him, though their parents quickly pulled them along. Michael unfolded the property listing again and followed the directions toward Plank Road. The fire station appeared slowly at the end of the street beneath enormous oak trees whose branches stretched across the road like protective arms. For a long moment, Michael simply stood there staring at it in silence. Red Oak Fire Station Number 7 looked even older in person. The two-story brick building leaned slightly with age. Its faded red garage door streaked with rust and dust. Several upper windows were shattered, their broken glass catching sunlight like tiny pieces of ice. Ivy climbed the western wall almost to the roofline. The station looked tired in the way old people sometimes look tired. Not weak, exactly, just forgotten for too long. Shadow stopped limping for a moment and stared directly at the building. His ears lifted, then unexpectedly, his tail wagged once. Michael exhaled slowly. Yeah, he murmured. Guess this is home now. The lockbox containing the property key hung beside the side entrance, exactly where the county instructions said it would be. The key itself felt heavy and cold in Michael's hand, older than most things people carried anymore. Inside, the building smelled like wet wood, old dust, engine oil, and years of trapped silence. Sunlight pushed through broken windows and pale beams that revealed floating dust everywhere. The garage floor was stained black from decades of machinery and boots. Upstairs, the former bunk room contained rusted bed frames, peeling paint, and a potbelly stove coated in ash. But despite everything, the structure felt solid beneath the decay. Michael walked carefully through each room while Shadow inspected corners methodically, like he was clearing a building again. Every few minutes, the dog glanced back toward Michael to make sure he was still following. You don't miss much, do you? Michael said softly. Shadow snorted lightly and continued searching. By late afternoon, Michael carried his duffel upstairs and chose the corner near the least broken window. He laid out one blanket for himself and another for Shadow beside the old stove. His body ached from travel, hunger, and accumulated exhaustion he could no longer separate into categories. Outside, Red Oak moved quietly through its routines. Truck engines hummed occasionally. Somewhere farther down the road, a screen door slammed shut. Church bells rang once across town before fading into the wind. Then came the knock. Michael immediately stood. Shadow was already at the staircase before the second knock landed. A man waited downstairs near the entrance holding a cardboard box. He appeared around 60 years old with broad shoulders softened by age and years of physical labor. His gray beard was thick but neatly trimmed, and deep wrinkles spread around pale blue eyes that looked cautious rather than unfriendly. He wore denim overalls over a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. My wife said I should bring this over before I changed my mind, the man said. Michael glanced at the box. Canned soup, bread, dog food. The man noticed Michael studying him carefully. Name's Walter Grady, he added. On the hardware store down by the tracks. Michael nodded once. Michael Reed. Walter's eyes moved briefly to the military jacket. Figured. Silence lingered awkwardly for a second. Then Walter sighed. Look, folks around here get nervous about outsiders. Last drifter who tried squatting in this building stole copper wire from 3 houses. Michael crossed his arms slowly. I'm not here to steal anything. Walter studied him quietly before answering. Maybe not, but small towns remember trouble longer than kindness. That sentence stayed with Michael long after Walter left. Night arrived quickly in Montana. The temperature dropped hard after sunset, cold wind moving through broken window glass upstairs with a low whistle. Michael lit a small lantern beside the stove and fed Shadow his medication wrapped inside canned meat from Walter's Supplies. The old dog ate slowly before walking downstairs toward the garage. A minute later, Michael heard him settle directly in front of the large garage door. Guard position. Same habit Shadow kept overseas whenever Michael slept. Michael leaned against the staircase watching the dog's silhouette beneath moonlight creeping through cracks in the garage windows. Something tightened painfully in his chest. Not fear. Not sadness. Something lonelier. The realization that one aging dog was still trying to protect him from a world that had mostly stopped caring whether he existed. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees with a low rustling sound. Then somewhere deep beneath the floorboards below the garage, Michael heard it. A loud metallic bang. Shadow instantly stood growling toward the darkness beneath the station. And then came a second sound. 3 slow knocks from underneath the floor. Morning arrived cold and bright over Red Oak, Montana. Sunlight filtered through the tall oak branches outside the fire station, casting slow-moving shadows across the cracked pavement, while pine-scented wind drifted through the broken upper windows. Somewhere beyond town, a freight train groaned low across the tracks, its distant echo rolling through the valley like thunder that had grown old with time. Michael Reed barely slept. The sounds from beneath the garage floor had kept him awake most of the night. Every small creak in the building made his instincts sharpen automatically. The same instincts years of military service had burned into him until caution became permanent. Shadow hadn't relaxed either. The old German shepherd spent hours lying stiff near the garage entrance with his ears raised toward the concrete floor. By sunrise, Michael could no longer ignore the feeling that something existed beneath the station. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from the corner of the apparatus bay and followed Shadow downstairs toward the lower storage area beneath the staircase. The basement smelled of wet concrete, old oil, mildew, and trapped decades. Weak sunlight spilled through narrow foundation windows near the ceiling, illuminating floating dust and thick cobwebs stretched between pipes. Shadow limped ahead before suddenly stopping near the far wall. The old dog began scratching aggressively at warped wooden panels attached over the concrete foundation. Not random scratching, focused scratching. Michael crouched beside him. "What is it, buddy?" Shadow let out a low growl and pawed harder. Michael ran his fingers along the wall and noticed something strange. Behind the rotted wood came a hollow sound instead of solid concrete. His pulse quickened slightly. He wedged the crowbar beneath the panel and pulled hard. The old wood splintered apart with a loud crack. Dust exploded into the air. Behind it sat a narrow steel door almost completely hidden by decades of covering. Michael stared silently. The steel looked military, heavy, functional, built for protection instead of appearance. Rust covered the hinges, but the faded civil defense symbol remained visible beneath layers of grime. "Jesus," he whispered. Shadow stepped closer, tail rigid. The handle resisted at first. Michael braced his shoulder against the door and forced it open inch by inch until ancient metal groaned loudly into the basement silence. A wave of stale cold air drifted out carrying the smell of old paper, machine oil, and forgotten years. Inside stretched a hidden storage room larger than Michael expected. Rows of olive green crates lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Emergency lanterns hung from hooks overhead. Metal shelves held canned supplies stamped with faded government markings from the 1960s. Dust coated everything thickly, but the room itself remained remarkably preserved. Michael walked slowly between the crates while Shadow stayed close beside him. His military instincts immediately recognized what he was seeing. Fallout shelter supplies. Cold War emergency stockpiles. One crate still bore black lettering. Property of U.S. Civil Defense Program. 1963. Another contained sealed wool blankets untouched for decades. Another held emergency radios, flashlights, medical kits, water purification tablets long expired. It felt less like entering a basement and more like walking directly into a frozen piece of American history. Then Michael noticed the safe. It sat against the far wall, partially hidden beneath an old canvas tarp. Smaller than a bank vault, but solid steel painted dark army green, with rust creeping around the dial lock. Unlike the crates, someone had tried covering this specifically. Shadow walked directly toward it and sat beside the safe without making a sound. Michael knelt slowly. Guess this is what you heard. The lock mechanism had already been damaged long ago. After several minutes with the crowbar and a hammer found nearby, the door finally gave way with a heavy metallic pop. Inside rested bundles of papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Beneath them sat a leather-bound ledger, worn soft with age. Michael opened the first bundle carefully and froze. Savings bonds, dozens of them. United States savings bonds issued across multiple years throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He stared at the numbers in disbelief before quickly recounting them. Even without calculating accumulated interest, the total face value alone exceeded $58,000. For a long moment, Michael simply sat there staring silently into the safe while Shadow rested beside him. A strange numbness spread through his chest. Not excitement, exactly. More disbelief than anything. Men like him didn't stumble into miracles. Life had taught him that repeatedly. He picked up the old ledger next. The leather cracked softly beneath his fingers as he opened it. Neat handwriting filled every page in dark blue ink. Dates, expenses, community donations, equipment repairs, volunteer names. The entries belonged to Captain Thomas Walker, former chief of Red Oak Fire Station No. 7. Michael paused on one particular photograph tucked between the pages. Thomas Walker stood beside an old fire truck, smiling faintly beneath summer sunlight. He appeared around 50 years old in the picture, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones, weathered skin, and thick silver hair combed carefully back. Deep lines around his eyes suggested a man who smiled rarely, but honestly. He wore suspenders beneath a firefighter jacket and rested one hand against the truck beside several younger volunteers. Something about his expression reminded Michael painfully of older military officers he once trusted. Men shaped by responsibility more than comfort. Page after page documented decades of small-town sacrifice. $5 donations from church bake sales, $2 equipment funds from railroad workers, widow contributions after local fires destroyed homes, tiny amounts from ordinary people trying to protect each other. Michael kept reading until he reached the final page. The handwriting there looked shakier, older, tired. November 14th, 1971. The station closes tomorrow. If nobody returns for what remains here, let these funds help the person willing to keep this place alive. Buildings die the same way people do. Slowly, when nobody remembers them anymore. Thomas Walker. Michael stared at the sentence for a very long time. Outside, wind rattled softly through broken glass upstairs. Shadow rested his head against Michael's shoulder, as though sensing the storm moving quietly through the man's thoughts. $58,000 could change everything. Rent, food, medical treatment for Shadow, a truck, warm clothes before winter. Maybe even peace for once. But sitting there in that hidden room surrounded by decades of forgotten sacrifice, the money suddenly felt heavier than wealth. It felt like trust. Then Michael noticed something else inside the safe. An envelope addressed simply to read family, personal. His blood went cold instantly. Because beneath the dust, written in faded blue ink, was his father's first name. Summer sunlight poured across Red Oak in long golden sheets, warming the old brick buildings and dusty sidewalks, while the smell of pine sap drifted through town beneath a bright Montana sky. The valley looked peaceful from the outside, but inside the old fire station, Michael Reed sat at a wooden table upstairs, staring silently at the envelope addressed to his family, feeling like the ground beneath his life had shifted once again. The letter inside had answered only part of the mystery. His father, Daniel Reed, had passed through Red Oak briefly in 1971 while traveling west after returning from Vietnam. According to Thomas Walker's handwriting, Daniel had helped repair storm damage at the fire station for nearly 2 weeks before continuing toward California. Michael barely remembered the man. His father died when Michael was 9 years old, leaving behind only scattered memories of rough hands, cigarette smoke, and a tired voice that always sounded older than it should have. But one sentence in the letter refused to leave Michael's mind. Your father told me a man survives longer when he has something worth protecting. Michael folded the paper carefully and slipped it back inside the envelope. Across the room, Shadow slept beside the pot-bellied stove, his old chest rising slowly with each breath. Sunlight illuminated the silver fur around the dog's muzzle. Watching him sleep always softened something inside Michael that years of military service had failed to completely destroy. 3 days later, Michael sat inside the county records office with Walter Grady beside him, while attorneys reviewed the contents of the safe. The office itself occupied a faded sandstone building near the railroad crossing. Ceiling fans rotated lazily overhead, while stacks of dusty paperwork leaned dangerously across old filing cabinets. The county lawyer, Evelyn Mercer, was a sharp-featured woman in her early 60s with pale skin, steel gray hair cut short around her jawline, and narrow glasses hanging low across her nose. Years handling rural property disputes had given her the kind of voice capable of silencing arguments before they fully began. She studied documents carefully, tapping one finger against the desk while Michael waited. Finally, she removed her glasses. "Legally speaking," she said, "everything found inside Station 7 belongs to the current property owner." Michael remained quiet. Walter scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Meaning the money's his?" Evelyn nodded once. "Every cent." The words should have felt victorious. Instead, they felt strangely heavy. Michael looked through the office window toward the distant mountains glowing blue beneath afternoon sunlight. $58,000 was more money than he had seen in years. Enough to leave Red Oak immediately if he wanted, enough to disappear somewhere warmer before winter, enough to stop feeling one missed meal away from collapse. But every time he thought about keeping all of it, he remembered the ledger, tiny donations from railroad workers, church bake sales, families who probably struggled themselves, yet still gave whatever they could to keep their fire station alive. That night, Michael sat alone in the apparatus bay while Shadow rested nearby, chewing slowly on an old rubber ball Walter had brought over. The building creaked softly around them beneath cooling evening air. "I don't think it was meant for one man," Michael said quietly. Shadow lifted his ears. "Crazy thing is," Michael continued with a tired smile, "I think you already knew that." 2 days later, the entire town gathered outside the current Red Oak Fire Department for a community meeting. News traveled quickly in places like this, especially news involving hidden money and Old Town history. Chief Daniel Hayes stood near the entrance greeting people as folding chairs filled the garage floor. Hayes was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with dark blonde hair, rough firefighter hands, and a square face permanently reddened by years battling smoke and heat. He had initially distrusted Michael deeply. Men responsible for protecting towns often distrusted outsiders automatically. But over the past week, that suspicion had begun softening into cautious respect. Michael stood awkwardly near the back beside Shadow, while townspeople whispered quietly around them. He hated public attention. Military life trained men to avoid standing out whenever possible. When Chief Hayes finally introduced him, the garage fell silent. Michael cleared his throat once. "I'm not really good at speeches." A few nervous laughs spread through the room. He continued anyway. "That money belonged to people who believed this town mattered. I don't think I have the right to keep all of it." Murmurs moved across the crowd. "So, half of it stays here," Michael said. "For equipment, repairs, whatever the department needs." Absolute silence followed. Then an elderly woman in the front row began crying quietly. Others stared at Michael differently now, not with suspicion, but something closer to disbelief. Walter Grady smiled slowly beneath his gray beard. "Well," he muttered softly, "guess you just confused the hell out of everybody." But the moment that truly changed Red Oak happened 3 nights later. The summer air had turned unusually dry and hot. Michael sat outside Station 7 sanding old wooden shelving while Shadow rested nearby beneath the oak trees. Crickets chirped through the darkness while town lights glowed faintly down the road. Suddenly, Shadow's head snapped upward. The old German shepherd stood immediately despite the stiffness in his injured leg. His ears locked toward the center of town. Then he barked, loud, sharp, urgent. Michael dropped the sandpaper instantly. Years of working beside the dog taught him the difference between ordinary barking and warning. This was warning. Shadow sprinted toward Main Street faster than Michael had seen him move in months. "Shadow!" Michael shouted, chasing after him. Halfway down the block, Michael smelled smoke, thick and bitter. Behind Marlene's kitchen, flames crawled up the rear wall of a storage garage connected to the grocery store next door. Dry summer wind pushed sparks dangerously close to nearby buildings. Without hesitation, Michael grabbed a hose from beside the alley while Shadow barked furiously near the back entrance, where an elderly stock clerk struggled to open a jammed door. Michael forced the door open with his shoulder and dragged the coughing man outside, seconds before flames exploded through the rear windows. Sirens filled the night moments later. By the time firefighters contained the blaze, nearly the entire town stood watching beneath flashing red emergency lights. Chief Hayes approached Michael slowly, soot still covering his face. "You and that dog probably saved half this street tonight," he said quietly. Michael looked down at Shadow sitting proudly beside him, smoke drifting through the dog's silver fur beneath the flashing lights. For the first time since arriving in Red Oak, nobody looked at Michael Reed like he didn't belong there anymore. By early September, Red Oak carried the kind of sunlight that made old buildings look younger than they really were. Warm golden light spilled across the valley every morning, touching the mountains in soft blue layers, while cool pine-scented air drifted through town before the heat of afternoon arrived. The abandoned fire station at the end of Plank Road no longer looked completely forgotten. For the first time in decades, people slowed their trucks when driving past it. Michael Reed stood on the roof beneath the Montana sky, replacing warped wooden shingles one section at a time. Sweat darkened the collar of his faded Navy SEAL camouflage shirt, while old scars across his forearms caught the sunlight whenever he lifted the hammer. Months earlier, losing his apartment in Asheville had made him feel like a man being erased piece by piece. Now every repaired board felt like proof that something broken could still survive if someone cared enough to keep working on it. Below him, Shadow lay stretched beside the garage entrance, watching the street with half-closed amber eyes. The old German shepherd moved slower now. His silver muzzle seemed wider every week, and sometimes his injured back leg trembled slightly after standing too long. But he still followed Michael everywhere like duty itself had become part of his bones. The people of Red Oak had started treating Michael differently after the fire behind Marlene's kitchen. Not dramatically. Small towns changed slowly, but the suspicion in their eyes softened. People nodded when passing him now. Some even waved. Every evening around sunset, Marlene Pierce herself brought food to the station. Marlene owned the diner near Main Street, a sturdy woman in her late 50s with curly auburn hair, always tied loosely behind her head, and strong farm-raised hands roughened by years of kitchen work. Her face carried permanent exhaustion beneath kind green eyes. 20 years earlier, her husband died in a logging accident outside Kalispell, leaving her to raise 2 sons alone while keeping the diner alive. Hardship had made her practical, but never bitter. "You're too skinny," she told Michael one evening while handing him a container of beef stew. Michael looked down at himself. "I'm pretty sure this is still considered normal-sized." "No," Marlene replied immediately. "That's divorced and homeless-sized." Michael laughed harder than he expected. Shadow lifted his head curiously at the sound. By the second week of renovations, Walter Grady brought over an electrician named Earl Bennett. Earl was 72 years old and looked exactly like someone who had spent 50 years working around wires and ladders. Thin as fence wire himself, with deeply wrinkled skin burned dark by decades of Montana sun, Earl wore suspenders over faded jeans and constantly chewed peppermint candies because he quit smoking 15 years earlier after surviving a mild heart attack. His hands shook slightly while resting, but became perfectly steady the moment he touched electrical tools. "You rewiring this place alone?" Earl asked while examining the ancient fuse boxes upstairs. "That was the plan." Earl snorted softly. That plan would have burned the building down by Christmas. Despite the insult, Earl charged Michael less than half his normal rate and spent 3 full days helping replace dangerous wiring throughout the station. People in Red Oak rarely offered kindness directly. They disguised it as practicality. Children began visiting too, mostly because of Shadow. 3 kids from neighboring houses wandered over almost every afternoon to sit beside the old dog beneath the oak trees. One little girl named Lucy Harper, Walter's granddaughter, became especially attached to him. Lucy was 8 years old with freckles across her nose, tangled blonde hair, usually escaping from crooked ponytails, and enormous, curious brown eyes. She spoke too quickly whenever excited and carried the fearless honesty only children possessed. "Did Shadow really fight bad guys overseas?" she asked one afternoon while brushing leaves from the dog's fur. Michael glanced at Shadow lying peacefully across the grass. "Sometimes. Lucy considered that seriously. I bet he was scarier back then. Shadow opened one eye lazily. Michael smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. The station slowly transformed week by week. Michael repaired broken windows upstairs, repainted the massive garage door its original deep fire engine red, and built a small bedroom beside the old bunk area overlooking town. At night, warm yellow light now glowed through the upstairs windows instead of darkness. People noticed that, too. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to imagine staying somewhere permanently. Then Shadow collapsed. It happened on an unusually warm afternoon in late September. Michael was sanding wooden shelving inside the garage when he heard Lucy scream outside. Shadow lay motionless near the curb beneath the oak trees. Michael dropped everything instantly and rushed toward him. The old German shepherd struggled weakly for breath, his chest rising too quickly while his body trembled violently. Panic hit Michael harder than incoming gunfire ever had. Shadow, he whispered desperately, kneeling beside him. Hey, stay with me. The drive to the veterinary clinic in Farmington became a blur of red lights, gravel roads, and fear. Michael held Shadow's head gently in the passenger seat the entire way while the dog's breathing weakened. Dr. Hannah Keller met them outside the clinic entrance. Hannah was a veterinarian in her late 30s with dark olive skin, tired eyes, and black hair tied into a severe bun that softened slightly whenever she smiled at animals. Years earlier, she had served as an army medic in Iraq before becoming a veterinarian after losing her military working dog during deployment. Since then, she treated every aging service dog like something sacred. After examining Shadow, Hannah removed her gloves slowly. Congestive heart failure, she said quietly. It's advanced. Michael stared at the floor. Can you help him? For now, yes. Medication, monitoring, maybe surgery later if things worsen. She hesitated slightly. But it'll be expensive. Michael already knew. He saw the numbers written across the estimate sheet sitting on the counter. Thousands of dollars. That night, he sat alone outside Station 7 beneath cold starlight, while Shadow slept weakly nearby wrapped in blankets. The old fire station creaked softly around them in the wind. Michael stared at the real estate listing open on his phone. Sell property, fast cash offer available. His thumb hovered over the number. Because if selling the station kept Shadow alive longer, he would do it without hesitation. Then headlights appeared slowly at the end of Plank Road. One truck, then another behind it. Michael frowned in confusion as nearly half the town began pulling up outside the fire station. Autumn arrived quietly in Red Oak, Montana. The mountains beyond town glowed deep blue beneath crisp October skies, while golden leaves drifted through the streets like slow-moving embers. Cold morning air carried the scent of pine wood smoke, damp earth, and distant snow beginning to gather somewhere high above the valley. The old fire station at the end of Plank Road no longer looked abandoned. Warm light shone through its restored windows each evening, and the freshly painted red garage door gleamed beneath the oak trees like a piece of the town's forgotten past finally breathing again. Michael Reed stood outside the station staring at the line of pickup trucks parked along the curb. Nearly half the town had shown up the night before after hearing about Shadow's condition. Some people brought casseroles, others brought envelopes. A few simply stood awkwardly near the garage pretending they had just been driving by. Small towns rarely said emotional things directly. They showed love sideways. Walter Grady climbed from his truck carrying a dented metal toolbox under one arm and a coffee thermos beneath the other. The old hardware store owner looked unusually serious that morning, his gray beard moving slightly in the wind while sunlight reflected off the cracked lenses of his reading glasses. You should probably open the box before your pride talks you out of it, Walter muttered. Michael frowned slightly. Walter, just open it. Inside the toolbox sat dozens of envelopes stuffed with cash, checks, handwritten notes, and folded bills held together by rubber bands. Michael stared silently at the pile while cold wind moved through the oak leaves overhead. Lucy Harper's note sat near the top in crooked pencil handwriting. For Shadow, hero dogs should stay. Michael swallowed hard. Other notes followed. Some anonymous, some signed. Railroad workers, church families, retired firefighters, ranchers, even people who had barely spoken to him before. Every envelope carried the same message in different words. Stay. You belong here now. For several long seconds, Michael couldn't speak. Shadow rested weakly near the garage entrance wrapped inside one of the old civil defense wool blankets. His breathing slower but steadier after beginning medication. The old German shepherd lifted his silver muzzle slightly toward Michael as though already understanding what was happening. Michael crouched beside him and rested one rough hand gently against the dog's neck. "Looks like they're not done with us yet, buddy." Shadow's tail thumped softly once against the wooden floorboards. On the drive home, Michael realized something strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about where to run next. He was thinking about getting back home before dark. That thought unsettled him more than any firefight ever had. By November, Red Oak Fire Station Number 7 had become part of the town again. Michael repaired the upstairs living quarters fully, restoring the old pine floors until they glowed warm amber beneath lamplight. He rebuilt the staircase railings, replaced cracked windows, and transformed the lower garage into a workshop where he repaired furniture, sharpened tools, and helped neighbors fix whatever broke around town. People started stopping by daily, sometimes for repairs, sometimes just for coffee. Chief Daniel Hayes even began bringing rookie firefighters to the station occasionally, so they could hear stories about the original Station 7 crews from Thomas Walker's old ledger. Michael noticed the younger firefighters listening carefully whenever Hayes spoke about duty and sacrifice. It reminded him painfully of military briefings years ago before missions overseas. Only now the atmosphere felt warmer somehow, less haunted. One snowy evening near Thanksgiving, Michael sat on the station steps beside Shadow while soft yellow light spilled from the upstairs windows behind them. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the street lamps while wind moved gently through the bare oak branches overhead. Shadow rested beneath several blankets. Older now, slower now, but peaceful. Lucy Harper sat cross-legged nearby drawing pictures with crayons inside an old notebook. "You know," she said suddenly without looking up, "Grandpa says this building was dying before you came." Michael stared quietly at the falling snow. "Maybe." Lucy shook her head seriously. "No, I think it was lonely." Michael smiled faintly at that. Children sometimes understood things adults complicated unnecessarily. Inside the station, Marlene's beef stew simmered slowly on the stove, while Walter argued loudly with Earl Bennett over football scores. The sound of laughter drifted downstairs through the old wooden beams. Real laughter. Warm laughter. The kind buildings absorbed into their walls over time. Michael realized then that he no longer heard silence inside Station 7 anymore. That night, after everyone finally left, Michael remained outside alone with Shadow. Snow covered the street in soft white layers while moonlight reflected gently across the town. Somewhere far off, a freight train echoed through the mountains. Michael looked down at the old German shepherd beside him. "There were a lot of years," he said quietly. "I thought surviving was the same thing as living." Shadow blinked slowly toward him. Michael exhaled into the freezing air. "Turns out they're not even close." He thought about Asheville. The eviction notice, sleeping in bus stations, the crushing loneliness that followed him after the military ended. For years, he had believed his life was becoming smaller. But now he understood something different. Sometimes life stripped everything away because it was leading you somewhere you never would have gone willingly. The old fire station had saved him as much as he had saved it. And Shadow had carried him through every dark mile between those two truths. A gust of wind sent golden oak leaves skittering across the snowy street beneath the streetlights. Michael pulled the wool blanket tighter around the old dog and leaned back against the station steps while warm light glowed behind them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Michael Reed no longer felt like a man passing through. He was finally home. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles the way we expect. Sometimes he sends an old forgotten building at the end of a quiet road. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog who refuses to leave your side when the whole world does. And sometimes when a person feels completely lost, God quietly places the right people in their path one by one until they finally find home again. Michael thought he had lost everything, but maybe losing everything was the only thing that led him to the place where his life could begin again. That's how grace often works. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, through kindness, through second chances, through people who choose to care when they don't have to. In everyday life, many of us carry silent battles nobody else can see. Some people are fighting loneliness. Some are grieving someone they loved. Some are simply trying to survive one more difficult day. But stories like this remind us that no life is forgotten in God's eyes. Even when a road seems broken, He may already be preparing a door somewhere ahead that you cannot see yet. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a warm meal, a helping hand, a loyal companion beside you, becomes the very thing that saves a life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what part of Michael and Shadow's journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories about faith, healing, loyal dogs, and second chances still matter in this world, subscribe to the channel and join our community. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that even in your hardest season, you are never truly walking alone.